Good morning and welcome to the KDPG Sunday edition. I'm Stacy Smith. These are exceptionally painful times for members of the Roman Catholic faith and for those who say they were abused by priests in the church. After the Pennsylvania grand jury handed down its findings about sexual abuse by certain priests dating back as far as 70 years, there were also accusations about efforts in some cases to try to cover up the abuses rather than report them to law enforcement authorities. The grand jury's report specifically noted Pittsburgh Bishop David Zubik and former Pittsburgh Bishop Cardinal Donald Wuerl for actions in regards to abusive priests. The state attorney general was strident in saying that both men were and are part of a cover-up. That is something that both prelates deny. So, less than a week after the report was issued, where do things stand? Will the grand jury's report and recommendations make a difference for those who were abused? And what action will the church and its leaders take? That is our topic this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. Later in the program, Bishop David Zubik and Rita Joyce, the Chancellor of the Pittsburgh Diocese, will be joining us. Now, though, we welcome two other guests. Timothy Hale is a partner with the Santa Barbara, California law firm Nye, Peabody, Sterling, Hale, and Miller. His experience includes representing survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and he helped to obtain what is believed to be the first $1 million pretrial settlement in the history of the Catholic clergy abuse scandal. Attorney Benjamin Sweet is a founding partner with the Pittsburgh office of Carlson, Lynch, Sweet, Capella, and Carpenter. David Shribman, the executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, is with us for this morning's discussion. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. Mr. Hale, I'm going to start with you because you are very familiar with a lot of these cases. I'm sure that you watched and read and are up to date about the Pennsylvania grand jury report. Given your history in dealing with abuse, what's your take on it?
Well, we had a very similar experience in Santa Barbara in 2006. The only difference was what at issue were personnel files of the perpetrators. Personnel files, psychological files, secret files, and laicization files. And my clients in that instance, much like the survivors here in Pittsburgh, fought for 6 years to have those documents released. And just like with the grand jury report, in that instance, the perpetrators and the hierarchy members who covered up those crimes stepped forward and objected and tried to block the release of those documents. And ultimately, at the end of that almost 6-year fight, the state Supreme Court, as it did here, rejected those efforts and ordered the publication and release of all those documents. So I see many parallels between what my clients in those cases experienced and what the survivors here in Pittsburgh have experienced with this grand jury report.
Did you have, in that situation in Santa Barbara, where you said that the hierarchy, as in here in Pennsylvania, was involved in the cover-up, as noted, Bishop Zubik and Cardinal Wuerl denied that they participated in any cover-up? And
that is, frankly, that's par for the course in these types of cases. There is a culture of hidden sexual abuse that is not unique to any one diocese. It is an institutional-wide problem that spans not just this country, but frankly, the world where the Roman Catholic Church performs its ministry. So this is not a unique situation at all. This is the way that the church operates.
Yeah, the grand jury report itself, Stacy, talks about a circle of secrecy, which is not a term that the grand jurors coined, but a term that Bishop Wuerl himself used. And Tim's absolutely right. This is a culture that's ingrained and has been there for decades.
I cannot sit here and try to speak for Bishop Wuerl, Cardinal Wuerl, but he states that is not a term that he created or used, that it was used by a priest who was interviewing a accused priest, that he did not come up with that term.
Well, the grand jury report speaks for itself, Stacy, and it does attribute the language to Cardinal Wuerl.
So noted.
Well, gentlemen, as a matter of law, I don't know which one of you is best to it. Is it unusual for a grand jury to promulgate a report without indictments?
I think the important thing to remember here is that indictments more often than not in these types of cases are impossible because you've got institutions that have worked overtime to conceal these crimes from law enforcement until the criminal statute of limitations have expired. It becomes impossible to prosecute these men, to hold them accountable and to force them to register as sex offenders. So as a result of that policy of secrecy, indictments do not happen, and that's what makes the publication of reports like the grand jury report so important. Without that type of information becoming public, the public has no way of knowing who poses a threat to their children.
As somebody who has dealt with this issue elsewhere and more generally, is this peculiar to the Catholic Church prelates, or is it reflect a more general thing?
Well, it certainly is a societal problem without a doubt, but there is a pattern and practice within the church that is sadly unique to what we've seen. There are some institutions out there that have engaged in similar conduct, but I've never seen anything close to
So
what we've seen.
is there any sector of our society where this is more prevalent than it is within the church?
I can't say there is. I think what we're seeing with the way the church has conducted its business and the way it's handled these reports of abuse is sadly unique.
All right. Let's go follow up. Do either of you gentlemen have any idea why these cells, so-called, are so prevalent within this one institution?
Well, there seems to be
And are other religious institutions equally full of this?
there seems to be an extra focus on preserving the reputation of the church at the expense of the welfare of children that are supposed to be protected by the church. And why that is, I do not have an
We
answer
have
to
lots
that.
of religions in this country. We have Muslims, we have Mormons, we have Jews, we have Protestants.
Certainly the Catholic Church is not the only institution to have suffered from these types of policies of secrecy, so to speak, and to experience them. But the breadth and the scope of it, I haven't seen anything that comes close to what has happened within the church. Now, that said, maybe that evidence is out there, and maybe eventually it will come forward in other institutions, and to some extent it has. We've seen it in the Boy Scouts. We've seen it in the Mormon Church. We've seen it with the Jehovah's Witnesses. But certainly the evidence has not come to light the way it has in the Catholic Church.
I want to we have a soundbite here from Cardinal Wuerl. I think it was the day after the report was released, and if I can call for number 4 here and then get your reaction to what the Cardinal had to say. Sure. This is Cardinal Donald Wuerl in Washington.
Part of my anger and part of the revulsion I felt was we thought we had this well under control. The report goes back before the charter. It goes all the way back 70 years. And when you look back and you see all of that, it sounds as if we didn't do anything. But when you look at the actual numbers from 2002 on, those numbers dropped dramatically.
Yeah, I find that report, that statement regarding the lack of reports since 2002 either reflects a naivete, which I don't think is the case, or a deep denial of the reality of how long it takes a survivor to come forward. The vast majority of survivors of childhood sexual abuse take their secret to the grave, and those that do come forward generally do not do so until they're in their 40s or 50s or 60s. It is highly unusual for anyone to come forward when they're in their 20s and 30s, or especially in their teens. So the idea that because there have not been reports of abuse since 2002, where there have been very few, that this evidences that the church has corrected course and changed its ways, it's too soon to say that. Come back and talk to us in 20 or 30 or 40 years and show us there have been no reports from that time period, and then you can say mission accomplished. It's far too soon to make that kind of pronouncement at this time.
I want to get into where we go from here with you, Mr. Sweet, in just a second, but from your perspective, and you've dealt with it and the statements you made here, is it so pervasive that all priests are involved in this?
Well, it depends on what you mean by all priests. Certainly not all priests are pedophiles, but I guarantee you that every priest at every parish has had some contact in some way or shape or form with a fellow member of the clergy who has been involved in this kind of conduct. They all know about how pervasive this is within the church. There is not a priest out there who has not had some kind of exposure and has some knowledge of the risk to children posed by those members of the clergy who are pedophilic.
Okay, great. Mr. Sweet, we want to bring you in on this because you're familiar with the Pennsylvania laws and everything.
Absolutely.
There were several recommendations made by the grand jury. Is this enough?
I think from our perspective, Stacy, it's a good start. There's 4 recommendations that were made by the grand jury. The first is obviously removing the criminal statute of limitations, which is currently in place. The second would be tightening up the notice law with regard to when this conduct is going on, what is the obligation to report the behavior. The third is creating a window to allow victims, for the very reason Tim just mentioned, the fact that the harm that we're talking about here, his deep psychological harm doesn't manifest for many, many years. And so the fact that most of these victims are not able to bring a lawsuit is something that should be righted.
Bishop Zubik said that he would be in support of all of these changes, all of these recommendations. If these recommendations go through, what do you expect to happen at that point? Are we going to see a lot more lawsuits filed?
I would imagine that we would see a significant number of lawsuits filed, Stacey, because as Tim has pointed out to me in our private conversations, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
What kind of recourse do people have who were victimized by clergy men who are deceased?
Well, it's not just about identifying the men who are deceased. Remember, there's also the importance of publicizing the men who protected those pedophiles and covered up their crimes. The public needs to know who they can trust to prioritize the safety of their children over the reputation of the institution. That's why this litigation is going to be so important, because this grand jury report is an impressive document. It's a great accomplishment for the grand jury and for survivors in the state of Pennsylvania. But there's much more work that needs to be done. The personnel files, the psychological files, the laicization files, the secret files of these men need to be publicized, not just to identify the perpetrators, but to identify the men who protected and covered up for them.
Well, will more stuff come from this grand jury, or has this grand jury been disbanded?
I understand it's still investigating.
What about the people who chose to have their names redacted? There are those who will say that an allegation may have been made, but nothing proven, but yet they were going to be included in this report.
I think that it is highly offensive that those names, and dangerous for today's children, that those names were redacted. Anyone who accepts the benefits of an institution that manipulates the criminal justice system and allows them to escape prosecution because the statute of limitations has expired should not be able to turn around and then say, my due process rights have been violated, and then try and accept the benefits of our justice system. That should not, it's wrong. It just shouldn't happen.
Mr. Sweet, we only have a couple of seconds left here, but you indicated just before we started to tape that you were Catholic as well.
That's right, Stacey.
So your take on this as an attorney who may be representing potential victims in conjunction with the firm out of Santa Barbara.
Right.
Your reaction to all of this?
Well, Stacey, it just so happens that my own parish priest from Mount Lebanon is one of the 99 priests from the Diocese of Pittsburgh who's listed in the grand jury's report. So it hits very close to home. And I think anyone who read the grand jury report and the detail, but also the very plain-spoken, common sense language that the grand jurors used, was moved by it. Horrified, certainly, but moved. And I think that's why we need to push for legislative action. The 4 points that are made in the grand jury report, if they can be enacted into law quickly.
Do you want to see more than that?
I think it's a good start, and I think that, you know, if that is brought to bear in the next 90 days, then we'll be well on our way down the road to a better situation.
If I could add, the reality is that this type of abuse, it's psychological murder. And just as there is no statute of limitations for murder in most states in this country, I believe there should be no statute of limitations for childhood sexual abuse.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition.
Thank you.
When we return, we'll be joined by Pittsburgh Bishop David Zubik and the Chancellor of the Pittsburgh Diocese.